Hey everybody, just that time yet again. Let's start off talking a little bit about the video I showed you last time. The write-ups were all pretty interesting. So Jared Diamond, environmental determinist or not? Who says yes? What are some of the reasons? Why do you say yes?
Well, most of the video was spent talking about how he thinks like the primary influence of like how societies developed was because of factors that were kind of outside of humans' control, like the climate they're in and what kind of animals they had and crops they had, that kind of thing.
Yeah, he felt like that it was geographic luck, right? It's like a roll of the dice. Where are you gonna be born? It's like, well, you can't pick it yourself, and so you're born somewhere that has some resources or doesn't. You wouldn't say he wasn't an environmental determinist. You want to say why? Or if you had to say he was not an environmental determinist, was there anything he said that was not environmentally deterministic of how societies develop? Well, there was one thing, basically when they talked about sustainability in the video and about how the Fertile Crescent, right, the cradle of civilization where there was the first agriculture and the first division of labor and all that stuff, although they had great crops, their soils and whatnot were not great. And actually this is a topic that we'll get into more in our chapter on agriculture, but in a nutshell, you could have pretty good farming in areas that are semi-arid, which means like they're not arid, they're not desert, but they're like right next to the desert. And if you have irrigation, those places that are semi-arids, they usually don't have a lot of water resources, don't have a lot of rain. But if you have a body of water going through it, a river, and you could figure out some irrigation, you could influence your environment, right? Like those were humans doing something to their environment. But it also overtaxed the environment. Similar to the Dust Bowl in the U.S. when we were kind of over-relying on wheat and we were growing it in a lot of areas that were not desert, but they're dryish, right? And I would say, in the Fertile Crescent, the agricultural revolution and it was sustainable for like 1,000 years, which is a pretty good run, right? It just didn't seem like a long time because we're talking, that was now thousands of years ago, right? And actually, well, the Dust Bowl, that happened much more quickly. That was only 100 years of farming, but of course that was much more rigorous farming techniques. It was intensive cultivation. That's actually a term in this chapter, subsistence agriculture versus commercial agriculture. Subsistence agriculture is if you have agriculture, but you're like growing enough for your community, and you don't really grow more than that, because why would you, right? It's only in the modern age that agriculture suddenly became something that people wanted to export. And if you want to export something, if you're not just growing enough for how many people you have in your community, well, then you really want to maximize, right? And so you'll really, you will exhaust the soils, right? Because in commercial agriculture, you're looking for a cash crop that will bring you in as much income as possible. And so usually you're just monocrop, you have one crop. You're not trying to get a diverse amount of nutrients for your community. You're just trying to export these, and it's up to the places that import it to pick what they eat, right? All right, fair enough. All right, let me go back to where we left off. Let's see here. Backward a bit. I think where were we? I remember we did do this part. Well, since we're talking already, let's talk a little bit about this activity you did. Because everyone actually did pretty good. And it was a slightly complex question. You all created lists identifying at least 4 negative impacts that population can have on the environment and society. Can anyone remember any of those negative impacts population can have on environment or society? Yeah. Pollution, right? So Egypt itself is actually rapidly urbanizing, and although you can see most of the population are not throughout the country, they're at a pretty narrow range along the Nile, and then along the delta, the flood delta here has very good soils, for example. Well, in Egypt, similar to much elsewhere in the world, agriculture as an occupation needs less and less people as it modernizes and as you get more and more machines doing it. Kind of every type of job there is, once you get machines are able to do it, you have less people doing it, right? Well, a lot of people are thus then losing their incomes and they're moving to the cities, and in that case, it tends to be this area up here. You've got a couple kind of main cities. You have people moving in there. When I was in Egypt, similar to much of the developing world, there's tons of garbage everywhere. I don't know if you saw in the pictures I showed you last time, but cleaning up your environment, cleaning up pollution, or even regulating companies to make sure that they're not polluting themselves, that costs a lot of money. That costs a lot of oversight, right? A law is useless unless you have the mechanism to enforce it. And so those things usually come about after a place has developed quite a bit. Pollution, any other negative impacts for,
Deforestation?
Deforestation, definitely in lots of places. Deforestation or just whatever is on the natural landscape is often just kind of consumed, right, by the people in a non-sustainable way, right? Any other negative impacts of, you could even use the word overpopulation. Too many people, yeah.
Like housing problems?
In Egypt, and as you'll see as we cover the rest of the world, lots of places have giant shanty towns or slums around the main buildings because you have all these people moving in from rural areas and they don't have any money, that's why they're moving. But they bring with them what they can, their animals sometimes and whatnot, and they'll just kind of put together a shelter based on whatever they could find. Very often this is just garbage that others have discarded. But you have these shanty towns that surround the areas because you just can't keep up with the housing. Even if you're building, it's just too many people coming to the central cities. And one thing I will say, actually, when we're looking at populations and population increases and the pressures on urban areas, that can even be in countries where the population is stable. Like the population itself is not increasing very much. People are not having a ton of kids. It's where they're moving to. You have these populations that are moving to the central cities looking for work, and there's never enough infrastructure, there's never enough services, there's all kinds of things that are not there for people. Those are some pretty good ones. All right, I think we'll move on. I'm trying to remember where we left off. I can't remember if we talked about dependency ratio. Well, I'll summarize in case we did, not to overlap it too much. So dependency ratio, there are age groups that in general do not add to the economy of countries, right? If you're too old, if you're too young, those are populations who are dependent on the other age brackets, right? So this population pyramid of Germany, you can see it is, well, it's not a pyramid, it's the opposite, right? Most population pyramids traditionally look like this top part where you have a large younger generation and a small older generation. But you have a circumstance in much of Europe, many places in the world, Japan, even China has started to look like there's countries that we kind of think of traditionally as having lots of kids and a big population. And it's like, well, why is this a problem? Well, like I said, you have this population here that are getting into retirement age. Retirement age in Europe tends to be younger than it is here, actually. It's in different countries, it could be 60, 62. Here, it was 64. It's moving up to, I think, 67. And then they have a deal where if you don't go for your Social Security until you're 70, you'll get like a bonus amount of money. So they're trying to push back, right? because, well, Social Security, it's that working population that are making the money that goes to Social Security, right? That goes to support the older population in general. Unless they plan to hit for their retirement, but most Americans, they're living paycheck to paycheck. They were not putting money away for retirement. And plenty cash out their retirement when they get maybe a major illness and they have large hospital bills that they can't pay. So they'll cash out their retirement thinking that they'll put money back into it later, and then they just don't. Dependency ratio. It's interesting actually because, well, Japan's demographic looks pretty similar, but they're even a bit older in general, and the younger generation is even smaller. And for many years, Japan had said that what they were going to do was they were going to utilize robots and AI to take care of the older populations, which seemed like a lot of wishful thinking, honestly, for many years, until kind of recently when we're getting lots of advancements in just that area. So who knows, maybe Japan's plan will actually pay out. Sex ratio, in general, births, the ratio of men to women, if there isn't, sex selective birth, and that could be lots of different things. During the one-child era in China, for example, if people were having a kid, well, traditionally it's the son that takes care of the parents in their old age. And so everyone wanted to make sure they had at least one son, right? That's your retirement plan. So what people would do is that they would get ultrasounds and whatnot, and if they had a girl, they often would terminate the pregnancy. Or they would give that child up to adoption, a number of different options. And so you can see how skewed it is in a number of different countries. Now this is looking at total population. You'll notice also in this area, right, we have the opposite effect, right? We have a lot more women than men. And that is not a birth thing, that is you have a lot of men in these countries who have died off younger than they would have otherwise. And it's for a number of reasons, yeah.
So can you explain Ecuador? Why is Ecuador dark blue? Because that seems like a very random.
That's not Ecuador, is it?
Is it?
No.
El Salvador.
Ecuador's down here.
Yeah, El Salvador.
Actually, this one has names on it. Let me double check.
El Salvador. I was wrong.
You're right. Ecuador, just so people know, it's this one.
Yeah. El Salvador. Right.
My hint is usually Equator, Ecuador.
Yeah.
Equator. Similar reason there. The wars. A lot of men die in wars, right? A lot of men die in wars. You'll notice that this is more than just Russia. This is a number of the former Soviet republics. What happened here is, similar to when many empires fall. When the Soviet Union fell, there was a lot of chaos. A lot of men lost their positions of power. The percentages of the population who turned to alcohol and whatnot, and kind of destructive behaviors, we'll put it that way. People moving into organized crime, things like this. This is a thing that happened, and the first decade after the fall of the Soviet Union was very, very rough economically, politically, socially, and they really haven't come back from that. They're still, this textbook, even though it's recent, it doesn't have the new numbers from all the new wars that are going on between Russia and Ukraine. That's going to make this ratio even more rough. Actually, I'm not going to have you do this partner activity. So when we're looking at those total populations and whatnot, number of aspects that are a part of that is, of course, fertility rates, right? How many kids are being had per woman? If you look at this map, you'll see, one thing to point out is China is not categorically where people often think of it. China's been in the news a lot recently for a lot of different reasons, but when it comes to demographics and population, the reason they've been in the news is Well, they did have the one-child policy for many years. We'll go into more detail on that in the next chapter. But one-child policy, that was because there was a bit of a population explosion, a very large population, and people were having lots of kids still. China basically, well, in 2015, they scaled back that because they're realizing that they didn't have a younger generation that could take care of the older generation. And so they did the opposite. They did things to try to encourage people to have more kids, and it just really didn't work. Just didn't work. People, once you kind of get a norm of having less kids, people just kind of want to keep on doing that norm. Because having kids is expensive, right? Well, China, one of the reasons it's been in the news as far as population is, for the first time they have had population loss, right? Their total population number always going up, but it was going up slower and slower. And of course that is, we've talked about a lot of the problems that happen when you have large populations, right? And China just didn't want to have those problems. China in general does not have the large shanty towns that we'll see in other places. They have been building and building and building, and they also have a system where they don't really allow people to migrate around unless you have permission. And so those big populations moving from rural areas to the cities, they just didn't allow it until they had construction and had housing for the people. Well, population now in decline. China's historically has been a place that there's been a lot of investment into, a lot of manufacturing, a lot of high-tech industry and whatnot. But now the world's investors, well, the world already decoupled from China quite a bit when it comes to trade and globalization. And so now the world is kind of like, well, if their main productive members of their society, they're getting older and we don't have as much of a younger generation, maybe we should just invest elsewhere. And you can see on this map, well, you have places that have very large population that are a bit earlier in the development cycle. They all want to take that business, and they will all have growing populations at this point. I would say if you're looking at like what areas will be in the future, places of investment kind of after these places stabilize, you could see the kind of up and coming area, right? Total fertility rate, actually I got a good graph. Kind of shows a number of things. So I was just talking about the different regions and, well, how many kids per woman you need to have a replacement rate. You can see North America, the average is a bit low, but we have a lot of immigration. In general, actually, Latin America and the Caribbean, compared to the rest of the world, they also get a fair amount of immigration into their countries. A lot of other countries and places of the world don't, right? Now you can see Asia, right, the place that we're very often talking about is having very large populations, but you can see in general, those population increases have really slowed down, right? And it's really Africa that we see as a place that are still having lots of kids, larger families as a norm. Knowledge check, we're not gonna do this knowledge check. Mortality rates, right? Talking about the opposite, the death rate, right? And there's lots of reasons that there are higher death rates in lots of places. For the most part, this map reflects infant mortality rates, right? Number of children who die when they're quite young. And actually, well, the Guns, Germs, and Steel documentary that I'm going to show you the rest of eventually, they actually go through some really good examples of this and kind of what's going on. Like I said, well, the interesting thing about Guns, Germs, and Steel and talking about whether he's an environmental determinist or not, what we saw in the first episode is really like the first couple of chapters of his book. In that context, he was very much an environmental determinist. But as you'll notice, well, the title of it being Guns, Germs, and Steel, he didn't say much about guns, he did not say much about germs, and he did not say much about steel, right? So it's actually, most of it is later on. As you can imagine, those are things that humans are involved with more than just their environment, right? Well, in a nutshell, these areas that have higher infant mortality rates, other countries of the world used to have much higher infant mortality rates, but as they developed and as their kind of healthcare became more advanced, those numbers were able to reverse. But there are places that are still developing and just don't have those resources yet. I'm not going to do this journal activity. Population pyramids, which we've already been talking about, and I've shown you a number of them. Some examples here from the book. Japan, as I was saying, Japan, you can see it has quite a large older generation, right? And then it has a bit younger, and this is still like relatively oldish. You can see quite a bit of a younger, smaller generation. Russia, lots of ups and downs, but really smaller, younger generation as well. Trying to take care of this older generation, right? You have a place like Democratic Republic of Congo. This is more the traditional pyramid shape that most countries around the world, for most of their existence, they had population pyramids like this until relatively recently. Let's see, some more population pyramids. We have the United States here. Now you can see that there is a older bump of age here, right? And then you have another kind of, well, older than you guys at least, bump in age. But like, it's pretty consistent, right? It's not what we would call kind of an emergency situation. Like, it's relatively stable compared to other generations. I think I've mentioned before that, well, the baby boom generation being a very big generation, there was a lot of worry that you'd had Gen X was a much smaller generation, and there was worry that the younger generations would be spending all their resources taking care of these retiring older generations. Honestly, by the time you guys are all like kind of in the workforce and whatnot, the baby boomers will be mostly deceased. So you guys won't be paying their bills. I guess I'd be paying my generation's bills, but I'm a smaller generation, so. Something else I want to show you on here. Oh yeah, China. This wasn't in the book, I dug this up somewhere. But you can see a much smaller, younger generation, right? This one here, this is India. You can see India, much more classic population shape, but also notice it actually is really leveled out the past 20 years or so. And so, you know, we would look for this to start decreasing at some future point. That's the most likely scenario. Let's see if we've got anything else. This is basically an example of, I believe, a retirement community. Different cities, of course, have different population pyramids. This is a college town, as you can imagine, right? You have a great big amount of one specific age. Let's see if there's anything else of interest in these ones. Not really. I'm not gonna have you guys do these exercises. Oh, we're done with the chapter already. Can't be. Oh yeah, a couple terms that were not discussed that are in the chapter but weren't actually discussed much in the previous slides. Actually, we did use the term carrying capacity, but I did want to say that in thinking about this term, it is very helpful for people often to think of the term spaceship Earth, right? When we talk about carrying capacity, that classically is meant, well, if you have a spaceship, right, you have to bring everything with you. So you have to plan out your resources. And so the worry has been for a long time that we were not planning out our resources, then that humanity was just having children and without any kind of foresight about how much resources they would use. And actually, agricultural density and subsistence agriculture, I did actually manage to work that into earlier in this. I would say, in general, when we're talking about population density, well, Jared Diamond did have a point that it is important to look at how much population you have compared to arable land, right? Productive land that you could grow stuff on. That is why, in general, when you're looking at these population clusters, they tend to be in places that are actually pretty good productive agricultural land, right? In general, on average. So let me put all these pieces together a bit. This is the demographic transition model. You might have looked at this in other classes or not, but this is in general what it looks like societies go through as they develop. When I say in general what it looks like, the UK, first country to industrialize, right? First country to industrialize. So many have studied it as a kind of, to see if that would indicate the way other societies would go. And it really depends. So in this scenario in the UK, historically, right, deaths were high, but births were also high, right? That's part of the reason people had lots of kids. It's because, well, if most of your kids are going to die off before they're 5, you're going to have a lot of kids, right? A big family. And that was the case for much of human existence, right? Just like a lot of deaths, but a lot of births. Through time, let's say places invent agriculture and they start figuring out kind of more medicine and health stuff. You still have a norm of having lots of kids, but the death rate starts going down, right? And so what happens through time is, in the UK, you would have a generation where like maybe the family, they had 8 kids, right? And it's like 3 survived. That next generation, when they have kids, they would also have 8 kids, but then 7 survive. And then they're taking care of 7 kids. Those kids growing up would often kind of be like, I don't want to have a family like that because that was not enough resources for the kids. So I'm going to have only 5, right? And then that generation, right, the death rate is going down even more. And the birth rate's coming down some. And then you have another generation that's like, actually, I only want to have 3 kids. That seems fine, right? And so the norms keep on decreasing as the death rate goes down. When we're at this phase here, when the death rate has started to come down, but the birth rate is still high, that's when you have a population explosion. And this is how it was actually in China when they made the one-child rule. When they made the one-child rule, the birth rates were still super high and the population was expanding dramatically. You can see through time what normally happens is these rates kind of come together again, and it kind of depends on the place, but in general, the birth rate drops below the replacement rate, right? In places that have developed. Now when I say that the UK was the first place to industrialize, the first place to go through all this, for a lot of years there are lots of arguments saying that this was only a UK thing, and that neighboring countries, they just had different norms, they weren't like the UK, and so that they wouldn't go through this. But then they just did, it was just a generation later. And even when that happened, there are arguments that other areas of Europe, people would say, oh, in Spain and Italy, they're Catholic and it's just normal to have big families, so let us have big families forever. And so they'll never go through this. Well, then sure enough, they went through it. Like I said, the same argument was made about Asia, right? It's like, oh, they just have the norm of large families that'll never change, and it sure did. And most countries at this point have gone through this, that's established that this does seem to be like the thing that happens. Even countries right now that are more having a higher birth rate, that are kind of in this phase, they're still going in this direction, so you can kind of see that, eventually it seems like all the countries will kind of have this. Any questions about that stuff? Well, all right. I think I'm going to have you work on some questions, but as always, I'm going to come out and form you into groups so you could work with new people and get some new ideas, new perspectives. But it's the same scenario as always. You want a piece of paper, everyone's full name on a piece of paper. Try to spell your last name very well so I can put it in the grade book. It's in your own interest. That's you. Oh, that's you too. Some other cards. You hold on, I'll put you with the small screw. Alright, so who has hearts? Who has hearts? Is there a cluster of hearts? Not really. You both are hearts. How about hearts over here? Who has diamonds? Who has diamonds? Diamonds. Man, kind of a cluster of diamonds there. Who has clubs? Looks like a big club. Definitely a cluster of clubs here. How about spades? Spades. Oh, a cluster of spades over there. All right.